I was about to leave the house that morning when I heard something I shouldn't have. She was in the kitchen, talking on the phone, her voice low, but with an excited, vibrant tone of someone who had just experienced something extraordinary. I met an incredible man at the party. Yes, it was hidden. I didn't tell him. No, he doesn't suspect anything. It was the best night of my life. My heart froze. Her every word stuck a dagger in my chest. At that moment, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Her face, which I knew so well, now appeared in my mind like that of a complete stranger. The woman with whom I shared years, with whom I had children, now seemed to live another life, one that I was completely unaware of. A secret life. The silence in the house suffocated me while that phone conversation still echoed in my head. I knew I needed to find out more. I needed to confirm what I already feared. I spent days acting as if nothing had happened, watching her every move, analyzing every look, every smile. Deep down, something told me that this was more than I could bear. And he was right. That week, she went out on a date with her friends, an excuse that now seemed empty, weightless, truthless. I decided to follow her. My mind was in turmoil, trying to make sense of what I was about to discover, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that night. She entered a discreet bar, far from the city center, and sat at a table in the back. It wasn't long before someone else joined her, someone I didn't know. They laughed, exchanged complicit glances, talked with the intimacy of those who have already shared secrets, of those who have experienced moments of passion. My chest burned with anger, with humiliation, with despair. Every fiber in my body wanted to go into that place and confront them, but something held me back. I left there with my hands shaking, my heart racing, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mind screamed to confront her, demand answers, end this charade. But anger was mixed with pain, and pain with the fear of losing everything. For days, every time I looked at it, I wondered how I hadn't noticed it before. How could she look me in the eye and lie? How could I live such a big lie and keep smiling at myself and our children as if nothing was wrong? It was then that I decided to act. I knew the only person who could help me was her mother. She had always had a close relationship with her mother, and I knew that if I told her everything, she would at least find some form of support. I was determined to expose what I discovered, to break the silence. But when I finally sat down in front of her mother and revealed every detail of the betrayal I had uncovered, the shock I expected to see on her face didn't come. She remained silent, her eyes lowered, as if she already knew everything. Anger boiled in my blood again. Could it be that all this time she was also involved? Were they somehow laughing at me behind my back? Or, worse, have I never really met the woman I married? Days later, I filed for divorce. I couldn't continue living a lie, much less let it continue to deceive our children. The truth needed to come out, no matter how painful it was. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she had with her friend on the phone. How could a woman I loved so much be willing to destroy everything for an amazing man she met at a party? What was so wrong with me, with our life, that made her look for it elsewhere? These questions plagued me every night, and I knew I would have no peace until everything was resolved. But something didn't add up. The more I thought, the more it seemed like there was something hidden, something I hadn't yet discovered. And then came the snap, the friend. She was always too involved, she was always the confidant, the shadow in our lives. Suddenly, everything started to make sense. I needed to go deeper. I needed to understand how far this betrayal went. The morning it all started seemed like any other. The sun was slowly rising over the hills, casting a soft light through the bedroom window, enveloping the space in a sense of peace. The morning air was still cool, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the house. Noah looked to the side of the bed, seeing that Claire had already gotten up. She was always the first one out of bed, organized and punctual as always. Their marriage, after almost 10 years, seemed stable, even with the routine challenges that time brought. Noah sighed and ran a hand through his hair, feeling the usual tiredness of someone who spends more time at work than they would like. He had always strived to be the provider. As a rising lawyer, important cases and demanding clients sapped his energy, but he was used to it. Claire, on the other hand, was the perfect balance to his busy life. She had a softness that he admired, a patience that never seemed to run out. She worked as an interior designer, and her talent for transforming empty spaces into welcoming environments was one of the things that enchanted Noah most. His creative and passionate look at the beauty of small things was what kept them together, or so he believed. The sound of quick footsteps down the hallway announced the arrival of the children, Liam and Sophie, running to the kitchen where Claire was already waiting for them with breakfast. The scene was almost perfect, the table set, the morning smiles and the light conversation between the two. Noah watched everything with a mixture of pride and relief. Having a family like that was a dream he had since he was young, and seeing it come true alongside Claire always comforted him. Although there were ups and downs, they loved each other. Or at least he loved it. Claire had been more distant lately, but he had always attributed this to the demands of her work, which had begun to accept increasingly larger, more demanding projects, which kept her busy at endless events and meetings. She had mentioned a party she needed to attend to close an important contract a few weeks ago. He vaguely remembered seeing her rushing out of the house that night, elegant as always, wearing a black dress that outlined her curves, her face illuminated by discreet but impactful makeup. She looked beautiful, and he was proud of it. As they ate breakfast that morning, Claire seemed more cheerful than usual, engaged in small talk with the children. Noah watched her from afar, with a slight smile on his face. She was still the woman he chose to spend the rest of his life with, and even with the challenges of marriage, he clung to the hope that everything was okay. He just needed to find a way to reconnect with her, plan a family trip or even a night alone, something that would take them out of their exhausting routine. In recent months, however, he had noticed a slight change in Claire, small details that he had previously ignored. She started spending more time with Melissa, her longtime best friend, and the two were always planning something, a night out or long lunches that stretched into the late afternoon. Noah didn't think much about it, after all, he knew how important their friendship was. Melissa had always been a constant presence in their lives, a friend Claire had cherished since college. Still, something about him bothered him. The messages exchanged frequently between the two, the complicit smiles that he couldn't decipher, and the repeated excuses for appointments with clients. Claire was different, and even though Noah tried to push those thoughts away, they continued to haunt him. But he didn't want to be the paranoid husband. He had never questioned Claire before, why would he start now? However, the feeling that something was out of place was hard to ignore. He remembered when they first met. Claire had always been the light in Noah's darkest days, bringing lightness and laughter to his life, even in the most difficult times. They fell intensely in love, driven by undeniable chemistry and shared dreams. In the beginning, they spent hours talking about their plans, their ambitions and the life they wanted to build together. Now, it seemed like the conversations were limited to day-to-day responsibilities and the logistics of parenting. The space that was once filled with passion and complicity now seemed to be occupied by an uncomfortable distance. Claire, on the other hand, showed no obvious signs of dissatisfaction. She was a caring wife, a devoted mother, and her career continued to prosper. If there was something wrong, she certainly knew how to hide it well. But Noah, with his sharp intuition, began to notice the gaps. The evasive looks, the automatic responses, the cold touch when he tried to get closer at night. Something was different, and it was eating him up inside. Still, he clung to the idea that it was just a phase. Every marriage goes through ups and downs, right? It was natural that after so much time together, some moments of disconnection would happen. But a part of him, a part he didn't want to admit, was beginning to doubt. Claire was a reserved woman, she always knew how to keep her emotions under control. And if something bothered her, she rarely talked about it directly. She avoided conflict, preferring to work things out on her own, and that, for years, worked for them. But now, Noah couldn't help but think that perhaps this way of dealing with problems was creating a rift between the two. As the day progressed, Noah watched Claire interact with her children, smiling and making plans for the weekend. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that morning, and he tried to convince himself that he was just imagining things. However, the memory of the night he heard her on the phone continued to pulse through his mind, like a warning sign he couldn't ignore. They were the perfect couple for everyone around. Their friends and family always commented on how happy they seemed, how lucky they were to have built such a solid life together. But inside the house, between the four walls, Noah knew there was much more than what others could see. And while Claire smiled and pretended everything was fine, he could no longer ignore the feeling that something was about to change. The signs were all there, spread among the days of routine and silence. But what he didn't yet know was that this change would be bigger and more devastating than he could ever imagine. The days passed, and the routine between Noah and Claire seemed increasingly automatic. They still exchanged banal conversations, about their children, school, work. But there was something in her gestures, a subtle detachment that, although imperceptible to anyone on the outside, was clear to Noah. He felt like Claire was somewhere else, even though she was right there next to him. Noah tried to ignore it. He tried to carry on with his life as if nothing was happening, but the doubt was always there, slowly eating away at him. He began to observe more closely, noticing how Claire was always on the phone, sending messages, exchanging brief smiles with someone on the other side of the screen. Who? He didn't know, but the constant presence of the cell phone at times when they used to talk face to face increased his suspicions. She mentioned commitments, last-minute meetings, small details that, previously insignificant, now formed a sequence of too perfect excuses. One night, as Claire was getting ready to go out again, Noah could no longer contain his anguish. He was sitting on the couch, watching her touch up her lipstick in the hallway mirror. The tight dress and high heels suggested this outing was more than just a professional meeting. He had commented before, casually, about the frequency with which these meetings occurred, but Claire always disarmed any suspicion with quick and confident answers. "It's beautiful," he said, unable to hide his bitter tone. "Another work commitment?" Claire glanced in the mirror, her eyes avoiding his, and Noah noticed the discomfort. She forced a smile. "Yes. It's important. Closing a big project, you know how it is." He nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off her. The silence that followed was heavy, each second prolonged by something unsaid. She grabbed her bag and, with one last hurried glance, left, leaving Noah with a growing emptiness. Something was wrong. And now he needed to know the truth. That night, Noah made a decision. He followed her. Keeping a safe distance, he watched Claire's car drive away through the lit streets and off the route it would normally take to the office. His heart was beating fast, adrenaline mixed with fear of what he might discover. Her destination was not an office, and the route that he had previously tried to justify rationally was now living proof that something was being hidden. The feeling of betrayal already dominated him, even though he didn't know for sure what he would find at the end of that road. Claire parked in front of a restaurant Noah didn't know. It wasn't the kind of place to do business. The dim lights, the discreet environment, everything there screamed that the meeting was more intimate than professional. Noah positioned himself on the other side of the street, protected by the darkness of the night, and watched. Claire walked in, and he saw her being greeted by a man who clearly wasn't part of any professional circle he knew. Claire's smile, warm and genuine, was unlike any expression she had shown at home in recent months. Noah felt a knot form in his stomach. They sat, talked, laughed. Every gesture between them felt natural, as if they were already intimate. Claire touched the man's arm casually, but the intimacy of that touch was unmistakable to Noah, who watched everything from afar, feeling anger mix with sadness and shock. Time seemed to drag by. Noah watched every second, every movement, waiting for something that would confirm his suspicions. He wanted to be wrong. I wish somehow this was all a misunderstanding. But then, confirmation came. He saw Claire lean across the table and kiss the man on the other side. A long kiss, full of affection. Noah froze. The world seemed to stop. His heart was racing, but his mind was completely silent. What he had feared for so long was finally before his eyes, as clear and cruel as he could imagine. Claire, the woman he shared his life with, was involved with another man. She had lied to him, betrayed not only his trust but the life they had built together. Unable to move, Noah continued watching. The couple left the restaurant, walking arm in arm, completely oblivious to the devastation they were causing. Noah remained standing in the same place, unable to act. The pain he felt was suffocating, and his mind was filled with questions that had no answers. What would he do now? How would you deal with this? The betrayal was there, before his eyes, and now he knew that nothing would be the same as before. But, even in the midst of the chaos of his feelings, something still bothered him deeply. How did that start? Why had Claire, who had always been so reserved and faithful, decided to throw everything away for this man? And more importantly, what else was hiding in the shadows of this betrayal? Noah knew that the answer wasn't just in that meeting. There was something more, something he hadn't yet discovered. And that answer would lead him to a truth even more painful than he could have imagined. But at that moment, all he could do was face the fact: his wife had cheated on him. And he needed to figure out what to do from there. Noah was sitting in the living room, his mind in a whirl. The lights in the house were off, except for the faint light coming from the street through the curtains. It was a heavy night, and the silence around him made his thoughts ring even louder. The image of Claire, laughing and kissing another man, was burned into his mind. He had decided to confront her, but something kept him tied to that chair, immobile. Part of him still didn't believe it, still clung to the absurd hope that there might be a rational explanation for all of this. Hours passed, until he heard the sound of the key turning in the door. Claire entered, her expression relaxed, as if she had just returned from a meeting with a friend, and not from betrayal. Noah watched as she walked through the house, leaving her bag on the couch and removing her shoes. He felt the weight of the revelation about to explode between them, and the tension suffocated him. "How was your night?" Noah's voice broke the silence, surprising Claire. She slowly turned to him, her initially calm face now showing a shadow of apprehension. "It went well. A little tiring, but productive," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Noah remained silent for a moment, watching her every move. His eyes were fixed on her, searching for signs, traces of guilt or regret. He felt fury bubbling beneath his skin, but he also knew he couldn't confront her with anger. "Not yet." "And even?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. "Who were you with?" Claire hesitated for a second, but soon regained her composure. She knew this was a minefield, and any false step could detonate the situation. However, she was used to dodging, to keeping up appearances. "Oh, with the project team," she started, but Noah interrupted her, his voice sharp. "Don't lie to me, Claire. I've been there. I saw you. I saw everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire froze, the blood draining from her face as she processed what he had just said. She tried to remain calm, but his words completely disarmed her. Noah's gaze was relentless, and she knew there was no escape this time. "What are you saying?" she began, but her voice wavered. "I'm saying I followed you," he said, his voice hard but controlled. "I saw you with him. I saw you two at the restaurant. And I saw you kiss." The impact of the words hit Claire hard. She felt her body shudder, the reality now undeniable. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. Noah waited for a response, but what came first was the sound of his ragged breathing, trying to find a way to defend himself. Claire began, but the words seemed to get lost. How could I explain something like that? How to justify? Don't try to make excuses, Noah continued, getting up from the chair and approaching her. I want the truth. And just the truth. How long has this been going on? Claire looked at him, her eyes now filled with a mixture of despair and fear. She knew there was no way around the situation anymore. And for the first time, she felt the weight of her actions fall upon her in a crushing way. It's been a few months, he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. She looked down, unable to look at him as the words left her mouth. Months, Noah repeated, as if he was processing the extent of the betrayal. He took a step back, as if he was being pushed by an invisible force. How did this happen? How could you do this to us, Claire? With our family? Claire closed her eyes, trying to keep the tears at bay. She knew there was no answer that could ease Noah's pain. There was no justification that could erase what he had done. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel that she had been led into this situation. Something bigger was at play, something she could barely explain. I don't know. I was feeling lost. Things between us have changed so much, Noah. You have changed. She tried to look for some thread of reason, some explanation that could make it less devastating. Have I changed? Noah laughed bitterly. Have I changed? I was here, Claire. I've always been here. And you? You were out there with another man. How do you think this makes me feel? She knew he was right. There was an undeniable truth in his words, a truth she had tried to ignore for months. And now, everything was there, exposed, bleeding between them. I know you don't deserve this, Noah, she said, finally looking at him. But I wasn't thinking. I wasn't acting like myself. I got carried away. Did you get carried away? Noah shook his head in disbelief. That's not an excuse. This will never be an excuse. The anger in his eyes was visible, and Claire knew there was no going back. She betrayed the trust that maintained the relationship, and there were no words that could heal that. However, as he looked at Noah, he felt something deep within him. Something she hadn't realized until that moment. Something that needed to be said, even if it didn't change the course of events. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. There was more to the story, much more than Noah imagined. And in that moment, she realized that the real reason behind all of this was not something she had done on her own. I don't know how to say this, Claire began, her voice shaking. Noah, still shaken, looked at her. His patience was at its limit. Just say it, Claire. Say it all at once. She took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to reveal would change everything. Claire remained silent for a moment, the words seeming to catch in her throat. She knew there was no longer any way to avoid what was coming. The guilt was there, visible, and Noah's gaze was relentless. He wanted the truth, but the truth wasn't simple, and the impact of that could be even more devastating than the betrayal itself. It was Melissa, Claire finally confessed, her voice low, almost suffocated. She influenced me, Noah. Noah frowned, confused by the name he heard. Melissa? Claire's friend? The one who had always been around, attending lunches and going out, the inseparable friend? He couldn't understand what Claire was implying. What do you mean by that? He asked, the tone of his voice mixing incredulity and anger. How could Melissa be involved in this? Claire took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure as she spoke. She's been pressuring me the last few months, planting doubts, saying things I couldn't get out of my head. She said that our marriage was worn out, that you didn't give me the attention I deserved, that I was canceling myself out to keep our family together. Claire paused, her eyes revealing the weight of what was to come. She introduced me to him. Noah's heart skipped a beat. Now everything made sense. Melissa, Claire's friend, not only knew about the betrayal, but was the bridge that connected Claire to the man she was involved with. Noah felt his blood boil, but he remained firm, trying to understand where this was going. "Did she introduce you to him?" Noah repeated, still trying to digest what he had heard. Claire nodded, teary-eyed but determined to continue. "Yes. She insisted that I needed more, that I deserved something different. She was the one who made me think that you didn't love me anymore, that I was trapped in a marriage that suffocated me. She convinced me to meet him." And, Claire stopped, her voice shaking with the intensity of what she was about to reveal. "I believed her. I believed I needed this." Noah felt a mix of anger and disbelief rise within him. Melissa, the one he always thought was a good friend, was actually a catalyst for the destruction of his marriage. How had he not noticed this before? How did you not see the signs? "Are you telling me that it was Melissa who made you cheat?" he asked, anger rising in his voice. "She convinced you to destroy everything we built?" Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with tears that were now beginning to run down her face. She shook her head, feeling the weight of the truth. "I'm not trying to apologize, Noah. It's my fault, I know that. But I never would have done it if it weren't for her. She poisoned me against you. And I let it happen." The silence that followed was oppressive. Noah stood still, absorbing the impact of what he had just heard. Melissa, the woman Claire called her best friend, had planted the seed of betrayal. She had poisoned Claire against him, fueling insecurities and weaknesses that Noah had never known existed. The betrayal wasn't just physical, she had been emotional, psychological, manipulated from the beginning. "How could you let this happen, Claire?" Noah finally spoke, his voice more controlled, but still filled with hurt. "Why did you believe her, instead of talking to me? Instead of trying to save what we had?" Claire sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she tried to come up with an answer. She knew Noah was right. She hadn't tried to save the marriage, had allowed him to crumble under the words of someone who should have been with him, not against him. "I was lost, Noah. I felt like something was wrong, but instead of talking to you, I closed myself off. And Melissa, she was the one who was there to listen to me, to support me." Claire hesitated before continuing, knowing that what she said next could be the final straw. "And I trusted her more than I should have." Noah shook his head in disbelief. How could Claire trust Melissa more than him? More than in the man with whom she had built a life, a family? The physical betrayal was painful enough, but knowing that Claire had allowed a third person to interfere in her marriage in such an insidious way made everything worse. "Melissa," Noah repeated the name, with a bitter tone. "And what does she gain from it? What does she gain by destroying our marriage?" Claire bit her lip, hesitant to say more. But she knew Noah deserved the full truth, even if it meant exposing the darker side of everything that had happened. "I don't know for sure," she admitted. "But I know she always envied what we had. She told me, many times, that I was wasting my life with her, that she would never accept living a life like mine. And I think that, in some way, she wanted to see me fail. I wish I was as unhappy as she was." Claire's words echoed in Noah's mind like poison. Melissa had always been around, always presenting herself as a friend, a confidant. But behind this facade, there was a woman who was plotting against him, who wanted the destruction of everything he valued. And the worst thing of all was that Claire had allowed this. "I'm sorry, Noah," Claire said, her voice weak and broken. I know that nothing I say now can erase what happened. But I swear, I never wanted to hurt you like this." Noah looked at her, his eyes filled with hurt, anger, and, more than anything, disappointment. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Claire's betrayal had been devastating in itself, but knowing that Melissa, someone he also considered close, had been the mastermind behind it all, it was too much to bear. Silence settled in again, thick and suffocating. Noah couldn't process the depth of the betrayal that had been revealed. He felt like he was sinking into a bottomless pit, where each new piece of information pulled him further down. And at the bottom of that well, he realized that the person he thought he knew better than anyone else was, in fact, a stranger. "I don't know what to make of this, Claire," Noah said finally, his voice exhausted. "I don't know how to continue after all this." Claire sobbed once more, her body shaking with the weight of guilt and regret. She knew that she had lost Noah, and that even if she tried, she could never repair the damage she had caused. I just hope that one day you can forgive me," Claire whispered, the tears falling freely now. Noah remained silent, unsure if forgiveness was something he could grant. All he knew at that moment was that the truth had finally been revealed, and it was more painful than anything he could have imagined. The silence that followed the revelation seemed endless. Claire was still standing in the middle of the room, her eyes swollen from the tears that continued to flow. Noah, on the other hand, had completely closed himself off. His mind processed the avalanche of information, but his heart felt like it was in a vacuum, unable to feel anything other than a deep emptiness. Claire's words echoed in his head, repeating Melissa's name like a constant stream, but there was no visible anger or pain in it, just deep disappointment. He walked away, slowly walking to the window, where he stared into space. Street lights flickered in the distance, and for a brief moment he wished he could disappear, leave it all behind. The woman he loved, the one in whom he had placed all his trust, was now caught up in a whirlwind of lies and manipulations that seemed endless. He knew the betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, a wound that had been inflicted long before he realized it. Noah took a deep breath, but the words still seemed stuck. Claire watched him closely, waiting for some sign, anything that would show that he was still willing to talk. She wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but she knew she was past that point. There was no longer any way to undo the damage. Now it was a question of emotional survival, for both of them. Finally, he spoke, without turning around. "I don't know who you are, Claire." Those words, spoken in a low and distant tone, hit Claire like a slap. She was already expecting anger, maybe even an explosion, but that coldness, that simple and devastating statement, left her breathless. How could she respond to that? How could she try to explain that she didn't even know who she was anymore? "I'm so sorry, Noah," was all she could say, her voice almost a whisper. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find a way to deal with the pain he felt. But the truth was, he didn't know what to do. "I didn't know if I was capable of forgiving her, and more than that, I didn't know if I wanted to. What would be left for them after such a profound betrayal? How could I look at Claire again without seeing Melissa and all the manipulation behind her actions? Do you know what's worst about all this?" Noah turned, his eyes dark with hurt. "It wasn't just the fact that you betrayed me. The worst thing is that you let someone who was supposed to be your friend destroy what we had. You let Melissa manipulate us, break us, and this," he trailed off, his voice trailing off. "I cannot accept this." Claire tried to get closer, but Noah raised his hand, signaling her to stop. He couldn't bear the idea of any more closeness. There was a distance between them that seemed irreparable. "I know I made a mistake," Claire began, her voice shaking. "But I was weak, Noah. I was confused, vulnerable, and she took advantage of that. I'm not trying to justify what I did, but you have to understand that I let myself be influenced because I was lost. I felt like you didn't see me anymore, that our marriage had become an obligation." "An obligation?" Noah repeated, incredulously. "We built a life together, Claire. We created a family. And you, instead of fighting for it, chose to destroy everything because of poisoned words from someone who clearly didn't want our best interests." Noah's words were like daggers, sharp and accurate. Claire felt the weight of each of them, sinking even deeper into the guilt she already carried. "And now?" he asked, his eyes fixed on hers, without looking away. "What do you expect to happen now?" Claire didn't have an answer. All she wanted was for time to go back, for her to be able to undo her choices, but she knew that was impossible. Things had reached a point of no return, and now they both needed to deal with the consequences. Noah, in turn, felt in a dilemma. Part of him wanted to scream, to throw Claire out of his life forever, to cut all ties. But there was another part, a part that still clung to the history they built, their children, the life that existed before everything fell apart. He was torn between hatred for the betrayal and sadness for the loss of what they once were. I just want you to forgive me one day, Claire said, her voice weak, knowing that forgiveness was something far away at that moment. Noah didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the window, trying to make some sense of the confusion of thoughts that filled his mind. He knew that forgiveness, if it came, would take time, much longer than Claire could imagine. And even then, there was no guarantee that this would be enough. The silence between them lengthened again, as they both tried to process the gravity of the situation. They were in the middle of an emotional storm, and words were no longer enough to bridge the gap that had formed between them. There was much more to be said, much more to be felt, but at that moment, everything seemed suspended in the air. Noah knew the road ahead would be long, full of uncertainty and heartache. And Claire, in turn, felt helpless, unable to undo what she had caused, but still wanting to find a way to fix what was left. They were trapped in a cycle of pain, a cycle they both knew wouldn't end easily. The days following the revelation were shrouded in oppressive silence. Claire and Noah shared the same house, but it was as if they lived in different worlds. The marriage, once stable and full of shared dreams, was now a shadow of its former self. The distance between them was impossible to ignore, and although they both knew they were on the verge of a definitive decision, neither seemed ready to make the first move. Noah spent sleepless nights, trying to find a way to deal with the pain he carried. The image of Claire with another man and Melissa's emotional betrayal haunted him constantly. The love he once felt for Claire was still there, but now it was tainted by a deep hurt. He could no longer look at her without remembering what had been destroyed. And more than that, he knew that Claire was also dealing with her own guilt and regret, which made everything even more difficult. One afternoon, Noah made the decision he had been putting off since that night. He filed for divorce. Claire received the news with a sadness that seemed to have been predicted. She knew she had reached the end of the road for them, but hearing the words, divorce, come out of Noah's mouth brought new pain. It was confirmation that there was no going back, that the damage she and Melissa caused was irreversible. Claire accepted Noah's decision without resistance. She knew she deserved it, and in a way, she hoped this was the beginning of her own redemption, although she knew that didn't mean she would be forgiven. They talked about their children, Liam and Sophie, the only thing that still connected them. Noah was clear about his desire to have custody. He wanted to offer them a stable environment, away from the emotional chaos that their marriage had become. Claire agreed, knowing that Noah was an excellent father and would be able to give his children what they needed. Although it was painful, she knew this was the only way to move forward. The process was quick. The divorce was finalized within weeks, and Noah had primary custody of the children, while Claire moved to a smaller apartment, close enough that she could be present in her children's lives, but far enough away to give Noah the space he needed. Noah, now alone with Liam and Sophie, has found new strength in fatherhood. He knew that the end of his marriage didn't define who he was, and, more importantly, he knew that his children needed him more than ever. The pain of betrayal still weighed heavily on his heart, but over time, he began to focus on what really mattered, giving Liam and Sophie the love and stability they needed to grow. Claire, in turn, immersed herself in her work, trying to rebuild her life. The weight of guilt accompanied her daily, but she also knew that she needed to move on, somehow. She sought help, therapy, trying to understand how she had allowed Melissa to influence her in such a devastating way. Her relationship with her children was strained at first, but over time, she managed to regain some of their trust, even though she knew she could never completely repair the damage she had caused. As for Melissa, her influence on Claire's life came to an end the moment the truth was revealed. Noah never spoke to her again, and Claire also walked away, realizing too late how destructive that friendship had been. Melissa tried to justify herself, but Claire knew she didn't need any more explanations. What was done was done. Months passed, and, little by little, Noah began to rediscover who he was outside of marriage. He reconnected with old friends, started dedicating himself more to work and, above all, building a new routine with his children. The weight of betrayal was still there, but he began to realize that forgiveness, although difficult, was a choice he needed to make, not for Claire, but for himself. He didn't want to carry that burden forever. One quiet night, as he was putting Sophie to sleep, Noah looked at her and noticed something that hit him unexpectedly. He was starting to feel peace again. Maybe the future wasn't what he had imagined, but there was a new beginning waiting for him. And that beginning, he knew, would be built on truth and love for his children. Claire continued with her life, now more aware of her own weaknesses and limitations. She knew her journey to forgiving Noah, and perhaps even herself, would be long. But somehow, she had also found a spark of hope that, in time, she could rebuild something, even if it was just her own dignity. In the end, life took its course. Noah and Claire took different paths, but they both learned that love and trust are fragile, and that once they're broken, they can't always be fixed. The betrayal had left deep scars, but at the same time, it opened doors to a new beginning, full of uncertainty, but also possibilities. What did you think of this story? Leave your comment below, we want to know your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. We remind you that the channel does not support any type of betrayal, but seeks to bring reflections on the complexities of human relationships.